In just 58 seconds, a freshman congresswoman would deliver an answer so devastating, so brutally honest, that it would silence one of America's most experienced journalists mid-broadcast. Rachel Maddow didn't expect it. The production crew didn't expect it. And the millions watching live certainly didn't expect what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. One question, 58 seconds, and the studio went completely silent. What happened in those 58 seconds didn't just go viral. It exposed a truth so uncomfortable that both political parties pretended they didn't hear it. But America heard it, and nothing would be the same. This is the story of the moment Jasmine Crockett broke through the noise, shattered political theater, and said what every frustrated American was thinking, but what no politician dared to say out loud. Before we dive into those explosive 58 seconds, you need to understand the pressure cooker that was American politics in late 2023. Congress was in chaos. The House of Representatives had just gone through 15 ballots to elect a speaker, something that hadn't happened in a century. Legislative business was at a standstill, and the American people? They were watching with a mixture of horror, frustration, and exhausted resignation. Trust in government was at an all-time low, according to Pew Research. Only 16% of Americans said they trusted the government to do what's right. 16%. That means 84% of the country had essentially given up on the system working for them. Into this dysfunction stepped two women who couldn't be more different, yet somehow perfectly embodied the moment. Rachel Maddow, the interrogator. Rachel Maddow needs no introduction. The Rhodes Scholar, the political commentator who built an empire by meticulously dissecting the news with a unique combination of historical context, legal analysis, and prosecutorial precision. Love her or hate her, Maddow is a master of her craft. She doesn't just interview, she investigates. She doesn't just ask questions, she builds cases. Her show isn't entertainment, it's a nightly legal brief delivered to millions of Americans hungry for someone to make sense of the chaos. But here's what makes Maddow dangerous as an interviewer. She does her homework. She knows the voting records. She knows the committee testimonies. She knows the financial disclosures. When you sit across from Rachel Maddow, you're not just answering questions. You're being cross-examined by someone who already knows the answers.
Politicians have learned to fear that desk.
They come prepared with talking points, carefully crafted responses, and escape routes built into every answer. Because with Maddow, one slip-up doesn't just make the news, it becomes the news. If Rachel Maddow represents the establishment's conscience, Jasmine Crockett represents its reckoning, elected to Congress in 2022. From Texas's 30th District, Crockett arrived in Washington with a resume that made the old guard nervous. Civil rights attorney, fierce litigator, and someone with absolutely zero patience for political theater. She wasn't there to make friends. She wasn't there to climb the ladder. She was there because her district, one of the most diverse in Texas, was tired of being polite while their rights were being stripped away. In her first year in Congress, Crockett became known for two things: her impeccable fashion sense and her absolutely devastating takedowns during committee hearings. While other freshman representatives were learning the ropes and staying quiet, Crockett was going viral for calling out hypocrisy in real time. There was the time she confronted Marjorie Taylor Greene during a hearing, leading to one of the most watched congressional exchanges in modern history. There was her systematic dismantling of witnesses who came unprepared. There was her willingness to say what everyone was thinking but no one was saying. But Crockett's real power wasn't just in her words. It was in her authenticity, in a building full of people who'd spent decades learning how to say nothing with great authority. Crockett spoke like a real person. She used analogies that made sense. She showed emotion. She didn't hide behind parliamentary procedure when something made her angry. And that made her dangerous. So when Rachel Maddow's producers booked Jasmine Crockett for a live interview in October 2023, they knew they had something special. This wasn't going to be another politician reciting talking points. This was going to be a conversation. The topic was supposed to be straightforward: the ongoing chaos in the House, the inability to pass basic legislation, and what it meant for American democracy. Standard political interview fare. What they got instead would break the internet. The interview started, normally enough. Maddow walked Crockett through the legislative gridlock, the failed votes, the internal Republican chaos that was preventing anything from getting done. Crockett was sharp, as always. She provided context, broke down the political maneuvering, and explained how the dysfunction was affecting real people back in her district. Standard A-block interview material. But then, about 7 minutes into the conversation, Maddow did what Maddow does best. She stopped asking about the symptoms and started probing the disease. She leaned forward slightly. A tell that anyone who watches her show regularly knows means she's about to ask the question. The one she's been building toward. The one that will define the entire conversation. The moment. "Congresswoman," Maddow said, her voice taking on that particular tone of genuine curiosity mixed with prosecutorial sharpness. "I want to ask you something that I think a lot of Americans are wondering, but maybe aren't hearing discussed in Washington." Crockett nodded, her expression shifting from prepared politician to engaged listener.
This wasn't a scripted moment. This was real. You're a civil rights attorney.
You've spent your entire career fighting for justice within the system. You believed in the system enough to run for Congress to become part of it. Maddow paused. The studio was silent. Even the crew seemed to sense something significant was coming. After a year in Congress, after seeing how this institution actually works from the inside. Do you still believe the system is fixable? Or have we reached a point where the rot is so deep, the corruption so systemic, that we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? And there it was. Not a question about a specific policy or a particular scandal. Not an opportunity for a partisan talking point or a campaign slogan. This was a fundamental question about American democracy itself, asked by someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer, to someone who'd seen the reality up close. The kind of question that politicians are trained to deflect, to pivot away from, to answer with something that sounds profound but means nothing. Jasmine Crockett didn't deflect for a moment. Just a brief moment. Crockett was silent. Not the calculating silence of a politician formulating a safe response, but the genuine pause of someone deciding whether to tell a truth that might have consequences. You could see it in her eyes, the internal calculation, the risk assessment. Because once you say certain things out loud on national television, you can't unsay them. Once you break the fourth wall of political theater, you can't pretend the audience isn't there. And then she made her choice. The answer begins. "Rachel, I'm going to be honest with you," Crockett began, her voice steady but with an edge of something. Frustration, exhaustion, anger, just beneath the surface. And I know my communications director is probably somewhere having a panic attack right now, but somebody needs to say this. A small, rueful laugh. Maddow's expression shifted from journalist to someone genuinely bracing for what was coming. The system isn't broken. That's what they want us to think. That it's broken, that it's dysfunctional. That if we could just get back to normal, everything would be fine. But here's the truth that nobody in that building wants to admit. The system is working exactly as it was designed to work, and that's the problem. When the founders created our government, they created it to serve a very specific group of people. White male property owners. That's not me being inflammatory, that's just history. And every single expansion of rights since then, every single time we've tried to make the system more inclusive, more representative, more democratic, it's been a fight against the system, not a function of it. Maddow started to interject, but Crockett was just getting started. I sit in committee hearings and watch my colleagues, grown adults who govern 750,000 people each, argue about whether books should be banned, whether certain Americans should have the right to exist publicly, whether we should investigate Hunter Biden's laptop for the 15th time. Meanwhile, we can't pass a budget. We can't fix our infrastructure. We can't address climate change. We can't protect voting rights. We can't do anything that would actually help real people. And you know what I realized? It's not incompetence. They're not stupid. They're not accidentally failing to govern. This is the strategy. Keep us fighting about culture wars. Keep us divided. Keep us outraged about whatever manufactured crisis is trending on social media this week. Because as long as we're doing that, we're not talking about the fact that wealth inequality is higher than it was during the Gilded Age. We're not talking about the fact that we're the only developed nation without universal health care. We're not talking about the fact that our democracy is being bought and sold in plain sight. By this point, Crockett's voice had risen slightly, not in volume but in intensity. She wasn't reading from notes, she wasn't reciting talking points. She was speaking from a place of deep, genuine frustration.
You ask me if I think the system is fixable. Here's my answer. Not from within. Not by playing their games by their rules. The system protects itself, Rachel. It protects power, it protects wealth, it protects the status quo. And anyone who threatens that, whether it's by demanding accountability or fighting for real change, or just telling the truth about how things actually work, gets labeled as radical or divisive or not serious.
I've been in Congress for less than a year and I've already seen how it works. The donors who dictate policy, the lobbyists who write the legislation, the media ecosystem that turns governance into performance art, the political consultants who teach candidates how to say absolutely nothing with great conviction. The whole apparatus is designed to prevent real change while giving people just enough hope that they keep participating. The knockout punch. And then Crockett delivered the line that would be clipped, shared, and quoted millions of times. So to answer your question, no, I don't believe the system is fixable from within. I believe the system is functioning exactly as designed. To concentrate power, protect privilege, and prevent the kind of fundamental change that would threaten either. And until the American people understand that, until we stop pretending that one more election or one more bipartisan compromise is going to save us, we're just going to keep having this same conversation while everything gets worse. Silence. Rachel Maddow, the woman who built a career on always having a response, always having a follow-up, always having another question, just stared. The camera stayed on Crockett's face. 58 seconds of unfiltered truth. No caveats, no qualifications, no but both sides' false equivalents. Just the raw, uncomfortable reality that everyone knows, but no one says out loud on national television. For what felt like an eternity but was actually only about 3 seconds, Rachel Maddow said nothing. She just looked at Jasmine Crockett with an expression that seemed to blend respect, shock, and the sudden realization that she'd just witnessed something significant. Then, quietly, almost to herself, well, okay then. Nervous laughter from somewhere off camera. The tension broke slightly, but the weight of what had just been said hung in the studio like smoke. Maddow recovered her composure, but you could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. This wasn't the interview she'd planned. This was something else entirely. Congresswoman, that's a remarkably honest assessment, Maddow said carefully. And I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people. But it also raises the obvious follow-up. If you don't believe the system is fixable from within, why are you in Congress? Why participate in a system you believe is designed to prevent the change you're fighting for? Crockett leaned back slightly, and you could see her consciously shifting gears from passionate truth-teller to strategic thinker. That's the question, isn't it? She said. And look, I'm not saying people shouldn't vote. I'm not saying electoral politics don't matter. I'm not advocating for giving up or checking out. What I'm saying is that we need to be honest about what we're dealing with. I'm in Congress because my community sent me there. Because they believed, and I believe, that we have to fight on every front. Legislative, judicial, electoral, grassroots organizing, direct action, all of it. But we can't keep pretending that playing nice, following norms, and hoping the system will eventually reward good behavior is going to work. Because it won't. The system doesn't reward that. The system rewards power. So yes, I'm going to introduce legislation, I'm going to fight in committee hearings. I'm going to use my platform to tell the truth about what's happening, but I'm also going to be honest with people about the limitations of what can be achieved within this framework, and I'm going to keep pushing for more fundamental change, even if that makes people uncomfortable. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter erupted, not with the usual partisan hackery, but with something different. People from across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, responding to the sheer honesty of what Crockett had said. Progressive activists were sharing it with comments like, "Finally someone saying what we've all been thinking." Disillusioned conservatives were grudgingly admitting, "I don't agree with her politics, but she's right about the system being rigged." Political moderates were torn between appreciating her honesty and worrying about the implications. The hashtags #Jasmine Crockett and 58 seconds started trending. Within an hour, news outlets scrambled to get their takes published. Opinion writers frantically drafted their responses. Political consultants started getting calls from nervous candidates wondering if they needed to respond. But here's what was remarkable. Despite the predictable partisan divide, there was a substantial group of people, maybe even a majority of those discussing it, who seemed to appreciate someone just being honest for once. The YouTube clip of the exchange hit 1 million views within 12 hours, 5 million within 48 hours. It was on its way to becoming one of the most watched political interview moments of the year. Of course, with honesty comes backlash, and the backlash against Jasmine Crockett was swift, predictable, and told you everything you needed to know about who benefits from the status quo. The serious people in Washington were horrified, not because Crockett was wrong necessarily, but because she'd violated an unspoken rule. You're allowed to think these things, but you're never supposed to say them out loud. Anonymous Democratic strategists started telling reporters that Crockett was immature, not ready for prime time, and damaging to the party's message. Never mind that the party's message had resulted in historic losses among working-class voters. Never mind that trust in institutions was in free fall. The problem, according to these unnamed experts, was that Crockett was being too honest. Republican commentators, meanwhile, seized on the interview as proof that Democrats were anti-American and wanted to destroy our institutions. They conveniently ignored that their party had spent the last several years doing exactly that, from attempting to overturn elections to threatening to default on the national debt to shutting down the government over partisan demands. Cable news brought on the usual suspects to discuss whether Crockett had gone too far. Former politicians and party insiders, most of whom had spent their careers accomplishing nothing of substance, wrung their hands about dangerous rhetoric and undermining democracy. One particularly memorable exchange on a rival network featured a former congressman lecturing about the importance of respecting institutions and working within the system. The interviewer didn't ask him why, if the system worked so well, his constituents had voted him out of office. Nobody ever asks those questions. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Crockett intensified. According to later reports, she received calls from party leadership suggesting she clarify her remarks. Donors associated with moderate Democrats expressed concerns. Political consultants advised her to walk it back before it damaged her long-term viability. The message was clear. Get back in line, or else. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While the political establishment was clutching its pearls, something remarkable was happening on the ground. Crockett's campaign received its largest one-day fundraising haul since the election. Thousands of small-dollar donations from people across the country who wanted to support someone willing to tell the truth. Her social media following exploded. More importantly, the comments and messages weren't just from her usual supporters, they were from disaffected voters of all persuasions. People who'd given up on politics, who hadn't voted in years, who'd written off the entire system, saying things like, "Finally someone gets it and this is why I'm paying attention again." Town halls in her district, which had been sparsely attended, were suddenly packed. Not with activists or political junkies, but with regular people who wanted to hear from a politician who spoke like a human being instead of a focus group. Other progressive members of Congress started echoing her message. Finding courage in her willingness to be honest, the Squad and other left-leaning Democrats began incorporating similar language into their own interviews and speeches, and perhaps most significantly, polling started showing that Crockett's message resonated far beyond her base. When asked if they agreed with the statement that the political system is designed to protect power and wealth rather than serve ordinary Americans, majorities across the political spectrum said yes. The contrast between the establishment's horror and the public's enthusiasm revealed something important. There was a massive disconnect between what the political class thought Americans wanted to hear and what Americans actually wanted to hear. The establishment wanted nuance, equivocation, and carefully calibrated messages designed to offend no one and inspire no one. They wanted politicians who could explain why real change was impossible without seeming like they'd given up. The people wanted honesty. They wanted someone to acknowledge the reality they were living. They wanted validation that they weren't crazy for thinking the system was rigged against them. Jasmine Crockett gave them that. And the establishment's negative reaction only proved her point. To understand why those 58 seconds hit so hard, you have to understand the broader context of American political discourse in 2023. For years, decades really, Americans had been watching their political system become increasingly dysfunctional, while politicians on both sides insisted that everything was fine, actually, and if we could just elect a few more of their party members, problems would be solved. Meanwhile, real wages stagnated while productivity and profits soared. Healthcare costs spiraled out of control. Student debt crushed an entire generation. Housing became unaffordable in every major city. Climate change went unaddressed while fossil fuel companies raked in record profits. Infrastructure crumbled. Gun violence became routine. Basic rights that people thought were settled became contested again. And through it all, politicians kept telling Americans that the system was working, that incremental change was the only realistic option, that anything more ambitious was too radical or not politically feasible. People weren't stupid. They could see the disconnect between what politicians said and what they experienced. They could see that the system responded immediately to corporate interests while their own concerns were dismissed as unrealistic, but they rarely heard anyone in power acknowledge this reality. Even politicians who genuinely wanted change felt compelled to speak in the careful language of Washington, to avoid saying anything that might be used against them, or might upset donors, or might be too divisive. In professional wrestling, there's a concept called kayfabe, the portrayal of staged events as real. Wrestlers maintain kayfabe by staying in character even outside the ring, pretending that their scripted rivalries and alliances are genuine. American politics operates on a similar principle. Politicians, journalists, and pundits all participate in kayfabe, maintaining the fiction that our political system is a functioning democracy where elections matter, where public opinion shapes policy, where the marketplace of ideas determines outcomes. Everyone involved knows this isn't quite true. They know about the outsized influence of money in politics. They know about gerrymandering and voter suppression. They know about the revolving door between government and industry. They know about the media's role in manufacturing consent. But they maintain kayfabe because breaking it, acknowledging that much of our political system is theater, that many outcomes are predetermined, that money and power matter far more than votes or activism, would undermine the entire structure. What Jasmine Crockett did in those 58 seconds was break kayfabe. She acknowledged the reality that everyone sees, but no one with power admits. The system is working as designed, and that design doesn't prioritize ordinary Americans. And in breaking kayfabe, she did something powerful. She validated the experiences and intuitions of millions of Americans who'd been told they were wrong for thinking the system was rigged. Crockett's answer wasn't just a momentary flash of honesty. It represented a broader shift in how a new generation of leaders thinks about and discusses systemic problems. Throughout American history, there have been moments when someone articulated a truth that everyone knew but no one had said clearly enough to break through. When that happens, it can mark a turning point. Eugene Debs running for president from prison and winning nearly 1 million votes. articulating a critique of capitalism that mainstream politicians wouldn't touch. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech, where he explicitly connected racism, poverty, and militarism as interconnected systems of oppression. Barbara Jordan's speech during the Nixon impeachment hearings, where she defended the Constitution by pointing out how rarely it had included people like her. These moments mattered not because they changed everything overnight, but because they shifted the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. They made it possible to say things that had been unsayable, to think thoughts that had been unthinkable. Part of what made Crockett's answer so striking was how it highlighted a generational divide in American politics. Older politicians, even progressive ones, were raised in an era when the American political system, for all its flaws, seemed to be trending in the right direction. Civil rights were expanding, the middle class was growing, trust in institutions was relatively high. The idea that the system could be reformed from within seemed plausible. Younger Americans have had a very different experience. They've watched the system become more plutocratic, more dysfunctional, more openly corrupt. They've seen promises of incremental change result in backsliding. They've witnessed crisis after crisis met with inadequate or non-existent responses. For many in Crockett's generation, millennials and Gen Z, the idea that the system is fundamentally broken isn't a radical fringe position. It's just obvious. The question isn't whether it's broken, but what to do about it. This generational divide explains much of the disconnect between the establishment's horror at Crockett's honesty and the public's enthusiasm for it. The establishment still operates under assumptions that many younger Americans, and increasingly many older Americans too, simply don't share. At a deeper level, Crockett's answer raised questions about the nature of systemic change and political participation. If the system is designed to prevent fundamental change, does participating in it legitimize it? Or is participating while being honest about its limitations a form of resistance? If electoral politics can't solve systemic problems, what's the point of elections? Or is the point something other than solving problems? Perhaps building movements, shifting consciousness, creating space for more radical action? If institutions are designed to protect power, what does meaningful accountability look like? Can you hold accountable a system that's working as intended? These aren't new questions. Radicals and reformers have debated them for centuries. But Crockett brought them to mainstream political discourse in a way that was accessible and direct. She wasn't offering easy answers, she was insisting on honest questions. In the weeks following the interview, something interesting happened. The conversation shifted. Journalists started asking other politicians variations of Crockett's question. Do you believe the system is fixable? Is incremental change sufficient? Are you willing to acknowledge systemic problems? Most gave evasive answers, some pushed back against the premise. But a few, particularly younger, progressive members, gave answers that echoed Crockett's honesty, if not always her conclusions. The mainstream political discourse, which had been stuck in a narrow Overton window of acceptable opinion, cracked open slightly. Ideas that had been dismissed as too radical, structural reform of the Supreme Court, abolishing the filibuster, aggressive antitrust enforcement, wealth taxes, started being discussed as potentially necessary rather than obviously impossible. Conservative media tried to turn the system as working as designed into a scandal, playing clips of Crockett on loop as evidence of a radical left-wing agenda to destroy America. But polling showed that many of their own viewers agreed with her assessment, even if they disagreed with her proposed solutions. More tangibly, Crockett's viral moment translated into political capital that she used strategically. She introduced a series of bills aimed at structural reform, mandatory disclosure of all campaign contributions in real time, banning members of Congress from trading stocks, closing the revolving door between government and lobbying, and strengthening enforcement of existing ethics rules. None of the bills had any chance of passing, and everyone knew it. That wasn't the point. The point was to force votes, to make members of Congress go on record about whether they supported transparency and accountability. When the bills predictably failed in committee, Crockett's office released a statement that was pure political judo. Today, Congress voted to protect the corrupt system I described in my interview. They proved my point better than I ever could. She also became a sought-after surrogate for progressive candidates across the country. Her endorsement, which came with a fundraising email to her growing list of supporters, could make or break a competitive primary. The Democratic Party's institutional response to Crockett was revealing in its contradictions. On one hand, they recognized her value. She was energizing young voters, she was bringing in small-dollar donations, she was generating the kind of enthusiasm that party consultants spent millions trying to manufacture. On the other hand, she made them nervous. Her unwillingness to stay on message, her tendency to say uncomfortable truths, her explicit critique of the system, all of this threatened the careful balancing act the party had been performing for decades. The compromise solution was typical of institutional politics. Embrace her for outreach and fundraising, but limit her actual power. She got high-profile speaking slots at events and plenty of media attention, but she didn't get appointed to the leadership positions or key committees that would give her real influence over policy. Crockett saw exactly what was happening and called it out publicly, which only reinforced her authenticity and further frustrated party leaders. Perhaps most significantly, Crockett's viral moment highlighted the changing media ecosystem and its effect on political power. Traditional media gatekeepers, the editors and producers who decided what was newsworthy, what was serious, what deserved coverage, were losing their monopoly on political attention. A clip of a congresswoman speaking honestly for 58 seconds could reach more people and have more impact than a carefully crafted campaign ad or a vetted op-ed in a major newspaper. This terrified the establishment, because it meant they couldn't control the narrative as effectively. A politician could bypass traditional media entirely, speak directly to voters through social media, and build a following based on authenticity rather than approval from gatekeepers. But it also created new pressures. The attention economy of social media rewards strong emotions, clear heroes and villains, simple narratives. Nuance dies in the feed, context gets stripped away in the sharing. Crockett's viral moment worked because it was both substantive and shareable, a rare combination. But the ecosystem that elevated it also created incentives for increasingly performative politics, where the goal becomes generating clips rather than passing legislation. As Crockett's influence grew, a more sophisticated critique began to emerge, not from conservatives trying to silence her, but from other progressive activists and thinkers who worried about the implications of her message. Some argued that by declaring the system unfixable from within, she was discouraging the very participation necessary to change it. If people believed electoral politics couldn't work, why would they vote? And if they didn't vote, how could anything change? Others worried that her message, while emotionally satisfying, didn't offer a clear path forward. Critique without strategy, they argued, was just venting. Still others suggested that her analysis, however accurate, underestimated the power of organized movements working both inside and outside the system. History showed that change was possible. Difficult, slow, incomplete, but possible. These critiques weren't in bad faith. They came from people who shared Crockett's values but worried about the tactical implications of her honesty. Crockett's response, in various interviews and speeches, was essentially, "Good, have that debate. That's the conversation we need to be having. But let's have it honestly, acknowledging reality, not pretending that if we just elect a few more Democrats, everything will be fine." The viral spread of Crockett's 58-second answer revealed several uncomfortable truths about the state of American democracy. First, it showed how hungry Americans are for political leaders who speak plainly. The overwhelming positive response to someone just being honest about systemic problems demonstrated that people are exhausted by political spin and carefully calibrated messaging. Second, it highlighted the massive gap between elite political discourse and how ordinary Americans experience politics. What shocked the establishment, Crockett's assertion that the system is working as designed, struck many voters as obviously true. Third, it demonstrated the power of social media to root around traditional gatekeepers, A moment that might have been ignored or downplayed by traditional media became a cultural flashpoint because people shared it directly. Fourth, it revealed the fragility of political kayfabe. Once someone with legitimate standing breaks the illusion, it becomes harder to maintain.
Other politicians found themselves having to respond to the questions Crockett raised, even if they wanted to avoid them. The question of agency.
At the heart of Crockett's viral moment was a profound question about political agency. If the system is designed to prevent fundamental change, what power do ordinary people have? This is the tension that defines much of contemporary progressive politics. On one hand, there's a clear-eyed assessment that the system is rigged in favor of wealth and power. On the other hand, there's a need to mobilize people to participate in that system because opting out doesn't change anything. Crockett's answer to this tension was essentially, participate but don't be naive, organize but understand what you're up against. Vote, but know that voting alone isn't enough. Use every tool available, but don't expect the system to reward good behavior. This was a more sophisticated message than her critics acknowledged. She wasn't advocating for giving up. She was advocating for realistic expectations and multi-front strategy. But it raised uncomfortable questions about what exactly could work if the system is designed to resist change, if institutional reform is blocked, if electoral politics has hard limits, if courts are captured by ideological movements, if media is owned by conglomerates with interests opposed to change. What's left? Crockett's answer seemed to be mass movements, direct action, changing consciousness, making the status quo untenable for those in power, not just voting, but organized disruption. This made many people uncomfortable because it sounded like revolution. But Crockett would argue, and did argue in subsequent interviews, that it's not revolution to demand that a democracy actually be democratic, the accountability problem. Another implication of Crockett's analysis was about accountability. If the system is working as designed, and the design is the problem, then who's accountable? This is a challenging question because it moves beyond individual bad actors, corrupt politicians, greedy CEOs, unethical lobbyists, to systemic issues. And systems are hard to hold accountable. You can vote out a corrupt politician, but if the system that enabled their corruption remains intact, the next politician will face the same incentives. You can penalize a corporation for wrongdoing, but if the structure that rewards wrongdoing persists, another corporation will take its place. This is why Crockett's focus on design was so important. She was arguing that we need to change the rules, not just replace the players. That the problem isn't that bad people have corrupted a good system, but that the system itself creates incentives for bad behavior. This framing shifts the conversation from individual morality to structural reform. It's not about whether this senator is corrupt or that representative is incompetent. It's about why the system consistently produces these outcomes regardless of who's in office. Crockett's analysis echoed arguments that have been made throughout American history by those pushing for fundamental change. The abolitionists didn't argue that slavery could be reformed. They argued it had to be abolished. The suffragettes didn't argue for incremental expansion of voting rights. They demanded universal suffrage. The labor movement didn't ask for slightly better working conditions. They fought for the right to organize and collectively bargain. In each case, there were moderates who argued that such radical demands were unrealistic, that incremental change was the only viable path, that working within the system was the only responsible approach. And in each case, history ultimately vindicated the radicals, not because their demands were immediately met, but because their willingness to demand the seemingly impossible shifted the Overton window and made previously unthinkable reforms possible. Crockett was standing in this tradition, articulating demands that seemed radical in the moment but might in hindsight be seen as obvious and necessary. Underlying Crockett's critique was a class analysis that American political discourse usually avoids. She explicitly named that the system was designed to serve white male property owners, in modern terms, the wealthy. She talked about wealth inequality, about how the system responds to power and money, rather than votes and activism. This kind of explicit class analysis is rare in American politics, which has a long tradition of pretending the class doesn't exist, or that everyone is middle class, or that wealth is simply the reward for hard work and talent. But polling consistently shows that Americans understand class dynamics, even if our political language doesn't acknowledge them. Majorities believe that the economic system is rigged in favor of the wealthy. Majorities support higher taxes on the rich. Majorities think corporations have too much power. What was missing was political leaders willing to name these realities clearly and consistently. Crockett filled that gap. Her class analysis also explained why certain reforms are blocked. It's not random that we can't address healthcare or climate change or worker rights. It's that powerful economic interests oppose these changes, and the system gives them the power to block them. While Crockett's viral moment made her a hero to millions, it also made her a target. The attacks came from multiple directions. Right-wing media branded her as anti-American, a radical, someone who wanted to tear down the country. They took her words out of context, framed her analysis as hatred of America rather than critique of its systems. More insidiously, she faced attacks from within her own party. Anonymous quotes to reporters described her as difficult to work with, not a team player, more interested in her brand than in legislating. These attacks followed a familiar pattern. When women of color speak forcefully, they're labeled as angry or divisive. When they refuse to play by unwritten rules, they're accused of being self-promoting rather than principled. Crockett received death threats. Her office reported a significant increase in hostile communications. Security concerns became a daily reality. But perhaps most troubling were the more subtle attempts to undermine her. Invitations to key meetings would mysteriously not reach her office. Amendments she proposed would fail to get hearings. Coalition partners would be pressured not to work with her. The message was clear. There's a price for breaking kayfabe. The personal toll. In a later interview with a local Texas outlet, Crockett spoke candidly about the personal toll of becoming a national figure. "I didn't run for Congress to become famous," she said. "I ran to fight for my community, and now I'm in this weird position where I have a platform and influence, but I also can't walk through an airport without being recognized, can't go to dinner without someone wanting to debate politics, can't have a private moment without wondering if it's being recorded." She talked about the strain on her family, the constant pressure to be on, the exhaustion of becoming a symbol rather than just a person. "There are days when I think about what it would be like to just be a normal member of Congress," she admitted. "To show up, do the work, not make waves, go home. It would be so much easier. But then I remember why I'm here, and I remember that if I don't say these things, who will?" This honesty about the costs of truth-telling was itself unusual. Politicians typically project confidence and certainty, even when they're struggling. Crockett's willingness to show vulnerability made her more relatable, but it also revealed the real stakes of political courage. But Crockett wasn't alone. As the attacks intensified, so did the support. Other progressive members of Congress, particularly other women of color who'd faced similar attacks, formed a protective circle around her. They coordinated messaging, shared staff resources, and provided emotional support. Grassroots organizations mobilized to defend her. When right-wing groups tried to recruit a primary challenger, progressive groups preemptively raised money for her re-election campaign and organized volunteers in her district. Legal organizations offered to help her office handle the threats and harassment. Mental health professionals volunteered their time to ensure she and her staff had access to support, and perhaps most importantly, her constituents showed up. Town halls remained packed with people who wanted her to know they had her back. Appreciation rallies were organized. Local businesses displayed signs of support. This grassroots backing gave Crockett the strength to continue speaking out, even as institutional forces tried to silence her. The question of compromise. The pressure on Crockett raised difficult questions about pragmatism and compromise in politics. Some allies suggested she could be more strategic, pick her battles, save the radical honesty for safe contexts. Play the game enough to gain power that could be used for change later. This is the classic argument for political pragmatism. You have to compromise to build coalitions, accumulate power, and eventually enact the changes you want to see. Ideological purity in this view is a luxury that prevents you from achieving anything concrete. Crockett's response was that this logic is exactly how the system maintains itself. By the time you've compromised enough to gain power, you've been co-opted by the system you wanted to change. You've made too many deals, accumulated too many obligations, learned too well how to think inside the box. They tell you to be patient, to wait your turn, to not rock the boat, she said in one speech. And 20 years later, you wake up and realize you've become the obstacle you set out to overcome. But she also acknowledged the tension. I don't have all the answers. Maybe there is a way to play the game and maintain your integrity. Maybe some people can walk that line. I just know that for me, in this moment, the cost of staying silent is higher than the cost of speaking out. 6 months after the interview, what had actually changed? On paper, not much. No major legislation had passed. The system that Crockett critiqued remained intact. The dysfunction in Congress continued. But measuring political impact only by legislation passed misses how change actually happens. Crockett had shifted the conversation. Ideas that were fringe were now mainstream in progressive circles. Politicians who wanted progressive support now had to at least gesture toward systemic reform. She'd inspired a new generation of candidates, people who'd been considering running for office, but felt disconnected from traditional politics, saw in Crockett a model for how to participate authentically. She'd built infrastructure. Her campaign operation became a model for other progressive candidates. Her fundraising list was a valuable resource for allied campaigns. Her media strategy was studied and replicated. Most importantly, she'd changed expectations. Voters, particularly younger voters, expected more honesty from their representatives. The bar for what constituted acceptable political discourse had been permanently raised. The 2024 elections. As the 2024 election cycle ramped up, Crockett's influence became more tangible. A slate of candidates, many of them young women of color, ran for Congress explicitly echoing her message that the system needed fundamental reform, that incremental change wasn't sufficient, that honesty mattered more than political calculation. Some won. Many lost. But their presence in the race shifted the debate, forced incumbent politicians to address questions they'd rather avoid, and demonstrated that there was an appetite for Crockett-style politics. Crockett herself became a star surrogate, capable of energizing crowds in ways that traditional politicians couldn't. Her appearances at rallies drew thousands. Her fundraising emails were among the most effective in progressive politics. The Democratic Party establishment remained ambivalent about her. She was useful but dangerous, an asset that refused to be controlled. Beyond electoral politics, Crockett's viral moment had broader cultural resonance. Her, quote, "The system is working exactly as designed," became a meme, a shorthand for expressing frustration with institutional failure. It appeared on protest signs, in social media bios, in opinion pieces across the political spectrum. Artists incorporated the quote into their work. Musicians referenced it in lyrics. Comedians used it in bits. It had entered the cultural lexicon. This kind of cultural penetration is rare and valuable. It means an idea has moved beyond political circles into general consciousness. It becomes a tool people use to understand their reality. Political scientists and historians began analyzing what they called the Crockett moment as an example of how political discourse shifts. Academic papers examined how a single interview could go viral and change the boundaries of acceptable political speech. Media studies professors assigned the interview as an example of how social media platforms were reshaping political communication. Constitutional law scholars debated whether Crockett's critique was accurate. Was the American system really designed to prevent fundamental change, or was that an overly cynical reading of the founders' intent? Historians drew parallels to previous moments when political figures broke with consensus and said uncomfortable truths. They debated whether Crockett represented a new political movement or just another chapter in America's long tradition of radical critique. This academic attention mattered because it moved the conversation beyond immediate political concerns to larger questions about American democracy, systemic change, and the nature of political power. Interestingly, Crockett's viral moment resonated internationally. In countries facing their own democratic crises, from Brazil to India to Poland, Activists and politicians saw in Crockett a model for how to articulate systemic critique while remaining engaged in the political process. Her interview was translated, shared, and discussed in contexts far removed from American politics. The fundamental question she raised, can broken systems be fixed from within, was universal. International media covered her as part of a broader trend of young progressive leaders challenging established political orders around the world. She was grouped with figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand before she resigned, and various young leaders in European Green parties. This international attention gave Crockett's message additional weight domestically. It was harder to dismiss her as a fringe figure when she was being taken seriously by political observers worldwide. As Crockett's influence grew, the establishment response became more sophisticated. Rather than just attacking her as radical or divisive, critics began making more substantive arguments against her worldview. Some argued that her cynicism about the system was itself a form of privilege, that people who depended on government programs or legal protections couldn't afford to give up on institutional politics, that while the system was flawed, it was also the only thing standing between vulnerable populations and complete disaster. Others contended that her analysis was historically inaccurate, that the American system, despite being designed by and for wealthy white men, had proven capable of significant expansion and reform, that the New Deal, civil rights movement, and other major changes demonstrated that the system could evolve. Still others suggested that her message, however well-intentioned, was strategically counterproductive, that it depressed turnout among people who needed to vote, that it made coalition building harder, that it played into conservative narratives about government incompetence. These weren't strawman arguments, they were serious critiques that deserved engagement. To her credit, Crockett engaged with these criticisms rather than dismissing them. In a lengthy interview with a left-leaning policy magazine, she nuanced her position. I want to be clear about something. When I say the system is working as designed, I'm not saying people shouldn't participate in it. I'm not saying voting doesn't matter. I'm not saying we should give up on electoral politics or institutional reform. What I am saying is that we need to be honest about the limitations and design features of our political system. We need to understand that certain outcomes aren't accidents or failures. They're the system functioning as intended. And yes, the system has changed over time. But those changes came through tremendous struggle, often from movements outside and in opposition to institutional politics. The system didn't reform itself out of the goodness of its heart. It was forced to change by people who refused to accept its limitations. So when I say the system needs fundamental change, I'm not being pessimistic. I'm being realistic. Real change is possible, but only if we're honest about what we're dealing with and what it will take to transform it. This more nuanced articulation didn't satisfy everyone, but it demonstrated that Crockett was thinking seriously about the implications of her message and willing to refine it based on feedback. Moderate Democrats, meanwhile, tried to reclaim the narrative by arguing that they too wanted reform, just more realistic, achievable reform. They pointed to incremental successes, regulations passed, agencies reformed, judges appointed. They argued that boring technical policy work, the kind that doesn't go viral, was actually how change happens in the real world. Their message to voters was essentially, don't be distracted by Crockett's revolutionary rhetoric. We're actually getting things done. The problem with this argument was that most voters couldn't see or feel the impact of these incremental changes. While policy wonks might appreciate the nuances of regulatory reform, people struggling with healthcare costs or stagnant wages or climate anxiety didn't feel like the system was working for them. Crockett's message resonated because it validated those feelings. The moderate response often felt like gaslighting, insisting that things were getting better when people's lived experience suggested otherwise. Within progressive circles, Crockett's intervention sparked intense debate about strategy and theory. Some argued she'd articulated what needed to be said, that her honesty was long overdue, that the movement needed more politicians willing to break with conventional wisdom. Others worried that she was making promises the left couldn't keep, that by suggesting fundamental change was possible, she was setting up supporters for disappointment when the hard reality of political constraints became clear. Still others debated the relationship between electoral politics and movement building. Was Crockett right that the system couldn't be fixed from within? Or was that formulation too binary? Perhaps it could be fixed, but only through a combination of inside and outside pressure. These debates were healthy, even when contentious. They represented a progressive movement grappling seriously with questions of power, strategy, and change. The media's coverage of Crockett also evolved over time. Initial coverage focused on the shock value. Congresswoman declares system unfixable. But as the moment passed and analysis deepened, more thoughtful pieces emerged. Long-form journalism explored Crockett's background, her district, her legislative record beyond the viral moment. These pieces revealed a more complex picture than either her champions or critics suggested. Opinion writers across the spectrum weighed in, often revealing more about their own political commitments than about Crockett herself. The interview became a Rorschach test. People saw in it what they wanted to see. Some media outlets tried to manufacture a feud between Crockett and more moderate Democrats, asking leading questions designed to elicit conflict. Crockett mostly refused to take the bait, insisting that disagreement about strategy didn't require personal animosity. Rachel Maddow herself did a follow-up segment months later, exploring how the conversation had evolved and explicitly pushing back against simplistic interpretations of Crockett's original answer. As of late 2024, Jasmine Crockett remained a polarizing but influential figure in American politics. Her re-election campaign was well-funded and well-organized, with minimal primary opposition. Her district remained solidly behind her. National progressive groups considered her a key ally. She'd used her platform to advance specific policy goals: anti-corruption legislation, voting rights protection, economic justice initiatives. Most of these efforts failed to pass, but they kept issues on the agenda and forced uncomfortable conversations. Her relationship with party leadership remained complicated. They valued her ability to energize voters and raise money, but wished she'd be more controllable. She remained willing to work within the system while being loudly critical of it, a balance that frustrated everyone. The questions Crockett raised in those 58 seconds remained unresolved. Is the American political system fundamentally broken, or just in need of reform? Can institutions designed to protect power and privilege be transformed into vehicles for justice and equality? What's the relationship between electoral politics and social movements? How much honesty can the political system tolerate? What does it mean to work for change from within a system that resists change? These aren't questions with simple answers. They're the questions that have defined American politics for centuries, asked in new ways by each generation. Crockett's contribution was to ask them clearly, publicly, and without apology, at a moment when they couldn't be ignored. The broader movement. Crockett was part of a broader shift in American progressive politics toward more explicit systemic critique. Other politicians, activists, and thinkers were making similar arguments in different ways. The ground was shifting beneath American political discourse. This shift was driven by several factors: the failure of incremental approaches to address mounting crises, climate change, inequality, democratic backsliding, the growing recognition that many problems weren't isolated issues, but symptoms of systemic design, generational change. As younger Americans with different experiences and expectations entered politics, the breakdown of traditional media gatekeepers, allowing for more diverse political voices, global trends toward both authoritarianism and democratic renewal, putting fundamental questions about political systems on the table. Crockett was both riding this wave and helping to create it. Conservative opposition to Crockett and politicians like her had also evolved. Initially, they tried to paint her as anti-American, someone who hated the country. This didn't work. Her critique was clearly rooted in wanting America to live up to its ideals, not in wanting to destroy it. They tried to caricature her as a socialist or communist, but these labels had lost their power, especially among younger voters who weren't raised during the Cold War. They tried to exploit divisions within the Democratic coalition, hoping that moderate Democrats would distance themselves from her. This had limited success. While there were genuine strategic disagreements, Democrats knew that attacking each other publicly just helped Republicans. What conservative strategists eventually landed on was more subtle. Acknowledge problems exist, but argue that Crockett's solutions would make things worse. Frame the debate as responsible reform versus reckless radicalism. This was more effective, because it didn't require defending the status quo or denying real issues. It just required creating doubt about whether dramatic change was safe. The path forward. So where does this all lead? The honest answer is, nobody knows. Political moments like Crockett's viral interview are inflection points, not endpoints. They open up possibilities without determining outcomes. Several scenarios are possible. Scenario 1, absorption and co-optation. The system absorbs Crockett's critique, makes some minor reforms, and continues fundamentally unchanged. Crockett herself becomes just another member of Congress, her radical edge worn down by time and compromise. This is what usually happens to reform movements. Scenario 2, building momentum. Crockett's honesty inspires more politicians to speak similarly. A critical mass develops. The Overton window shifts permanently. Policy changes that seemed impossible become inevitable. This is how the New Deal and civil rights movements eventually succeeded. Scenario 3, backlash and regression. The forces that benefit from the current system successfully paint Crockett and politicians like her as dangerous radicals. They use fear of change to mobilize support for even more anti-democratic policies. This is how Reconstruction ended, and how many global reform movements have been crushed. Scenario 4, parallel systems, unable to reform existing institutions. New forms of political organization emerge alongside them. Mutual aid networks, alternative economic structures, new forms of democratic participation. This is what's happening in many communities already. Most likely, the reality will be some messy combination of all these scenarios, playing out differently in different contexts. Step back from the immediate political implications, and those 58 seconds reveal something profound about truth-telling, power, and change. First, they demonstrated the hunger for authenticity in an age of carefully managed political personas, of focus-grouped messaging, of politicians who say nothing while appearing to say something. Genuine honesty cuts through. People respond to it even when they disagree with the specific politics. Second, they showed the power of naming systems. So much political discourse focuses on individuals. This politician is corrupt, that official is incompetent. Crockett shifted focus to the system itself, to the structures that produce consistent outcomes regardless of who's in charge. That's a more challenging but more honest form of analysis. Third, they revealed the gap between elite discourse and public sentiment, what shocked the political establishment. The suggestion that the system is fundamentally problematic resonated with huge swaths of the public who've been saying this for years. The disconnect between these two spheres is itself a political crisis. Fourth, they illustrated the changing nature of political communication. A viral clip can have more impact than months of traditional campaigning. This isn't necessarily good or bad, it's just the reality that political actors have to navigate. Fifth, they raised questions about the relationship between honesty and effectiveness in politics. Can you be completely honest and still build the coalitions necessary to pass legislation? Or does the political process require strategic ambiguity? Crockett was testing those boundaries in real time. Beyond the political analysis, there's something deeply human about what happened in those 58 seconds. A woman, a black woman, a young woman, a woman new to power, decided to tell the truth as she saw it, knowing it might cost her. That's not nothing. Think about how many people in positions of power make the opposite choice every day. They know what they believe, but they calculate that saying it would be too risky. They compromise, equivocate, stay silent. Sometimes that calculation is right. Sometimes strategic silence is necessary to preserve the ability to fight another day. But there's also a cost to that silence, a cost to your soul, to your sense of yourself. to your relationship with the people who trusted you with power. Crockett chose differently in that moment, and whatever you think of her politics, there's something admirable about someone deciding that some truths are too important to leave unsaid, regardless of the consequences. The question of hope. One criticism of Crockett's message was that it was too pessimistic, that it discouraged the hope necessary for political engagement. But there's a difference between naive hope and clear-eyed hope. Naive hope says, things will work out. The system will eventually do the right thing. Just be patient and keep believing. Clear-eyed hope says, things are bad. The system is designed to resist change. The obstacles are real, but change is still possible if we're honest about what we're facing and willing to fight for it. Crockett was offering clear-eyed hope. She wasn't saying give up. She was saying, understand what you're up against. And in some ways, that's more hopeful than the alternative, because naive hope sets people up for disappointment and disillusionment. When you've been told that one more election will fix things and it doesn't, you give up. But if you understand from the beginning that change is hard, that it requires sustained effort, that there will be setbacks, then you're prepared for the long fight. You're not surprised when progress is slow. You don't give up at the first obstacle. Finally, those 58 seconds resonated because they spoke to something universal. The experience of being stuck in a system that doesn't serve you. It's not just political systems. It's also economic systems, educational systems, healthcare systems, justice systems. Most people have experienced the frustration of dealing with an institution that seems designed to make their life harder rather than easier. Most people have had the experience of being told that's just how things work when they complain about something obviously unjust or dysfunctional. Most people have felt the powerlessness of knowing something is wrong but not knowing how to fix it. Crockett gave voice to that universal experience, and while her specific critique was about American politics, the underlying sentiment that systems often perpetuate themselves rather than serve their stated purposes resonated with anyone who's ever felt trapped by bureaucracy, capitalism, injustice, or dysfunction. In a strange way, her political critique became something more than political. It became a statement about the human experience of navigating institutions that wield power over our lives. Let's return to where we started. Rachel Maddow's studio, October 2023, that question hanging in the air. After seeing how this institution actually works from the inside, do you still believe the system is fixable? In the moment before Jasmine Crockett answered, everything was possible. She could have given a safe answer, a political answer, an answer that wouldn't make waves. She chose differently. 58 seconds of unflinching honesty. 58 seconds that would be shared millions of times. 58 seconds that would launch think pieces, academic analyses, political debates, and grassroots organizing. 58 seconds that didn't change everything, but changed something. Because here's the thing about moments like this. They don't resolve questions, they open them. They don't end debates, they begin them. They don't fix systems, but they make it possible to imagine fixing them. The ongoing story. This story doesn't have an ending yet. It's still being written. Jasmine Crockett is still in Congress, still fighting, still speaking uncomfortable truths. The system she critiqued is still in place, still resistant to change, still producing outcomes that benefit the powerful at the expense of everyone else. The question she raised, can broken systems be fixed from within, remains unanswered. Maybe it's unanswerable. Maybe the answer is different, in different contexts, different moments, different struggles. But the question itself is valuable. It forces honesty. It demands that we confront realities we'd rather avoid. It challenges the comfortable, fictions that allow injustice to persist. The challenge. And ultimately, that's the challenge Crockett posed in those 58 seconds, not just to the political system, but to each of us. Are we willing to be honest about what we're facing? Are we willing to name systems and structures, not just individual bad actors? Are we willing to imagine fundamental change, not just incremental reform? Are we willing to do the difficult, unglamorous, frustrating work of actually transforming institutions rather than just complaining about them? Are we willing to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that will determine whether American democracy survives and evolves, or ossifies and dies. In just 58 seconds, Jasmine Crockett didn't solve anything. But she did something equally important. She told the truth in a political environment built on euphemism, on spin, on carefully calibrated messaging designed to offend no one and inspire no one. She spoke plainly about power, about systems, about the disconnect between democratic ideals and democratic reality, and in doing so she reminded us that change begins not with perfect strategies or overwhelming power, but with someone willing to name what everyone knows, but no one says.
The studio froze because truth does that. It stops time, it forces attention, it demands response.
58 seconds, one question, one answer, and everything changed, or at least everything became possible to change. That's the power of truth-telling. That's the power of authenticity. That's the power of someone deciding that some things matter more than political calculation. Rachel Maddow asked one question. Jasmine Crockett answered honestly. And America is still processing what happened in those 58 seconds.